I had barely stepped onto the sidewalk outside the Naval Hall when the security officer raised a hand to stop me. He glanced down at the clipboard, then back up with a polite but firm expression. "Ma'am, your name isn't on the list." The words landed sharper than they should have, but it was the smirk from my father standing a few feet away that really cut. He leaned toward a fellow officer and said in a tone meant for me to hear, "She's not even invited." My heart thudded not from embarrassment, but from a familiar sting I had known my entire life. The air was crisp with the faint scent of the ocean, the kind of day that should have felt celebratory. Instead, I stood there at the gate to my father's retirement ceremony and my brother's promotion, being told I didn't belong. I could see Michael inside, shaking hands, the golden boy in his spotless uniform soaking in the applause. My father's gaze flicked past me as if I were another face in the crowd, not his daughter. That was the story they had written for me years ago, the one where I was the afterthought, the one who didn't quite measure up to the family's idea of a real naval officer. But that story was no longer true, and today was the day they would find out. What no one here knew, not my father, not my brother, not the rows of decorated guests, was that I had been promoted to Rear Admiral just weeks ago. The Navy had kept it quiet until the official announcement, and I had kept it even quieter from my family. Standing at that gate, feeling the cold metal of my ID in my hand, I decided that walking away was not an option. I wasn't going to argue my way in. I wasn't going to beg for a seat. I was going to walk into that hall on my own terms, wearing the truth on my shoulders where no one could ignore it. And when I did, there would be no mistaking exactly who I was. I grew up in Coronado, a place where the ocean air carried the sound of taps from the naval base, and where military service wasn't just respected, it was expected. My father, Captain Daniel Hayes, was a man whose presence could fill a room without raising his voice. He believed in disciplined tradition and the kind of command that came from standing on the deck of a ship with the wind in your face. My brother Michael fit perfectly into that vision. From the time he could walk, he was loud, athletic, and seemed born to wear a uniform. I was different. I liked books more than ball games, puzzles more than parades. While Michael was out winning trophies, I was in my room learning to break codes and studying strategy maps from old wars. My father never scolded me for it, but there was always a distance in his eyes when he looked my way. He valued strength. You could see victories, you could photograph, and I was a set of quiet victories he never seemed to notice. Family gatherings always had a way of highlighting that gap. When Michael got into the Naval Academy, the backyard turned into a celebration that could have been mistaken for a victory parade. The grill-smoked veterans swapped stories, and my father beamed like the war had already been won. 3 days earlier, I had placed first in a national cyber defense competition, but when I mentioned it, Dad nodded once and said, "That's nice, Rebecca, but it's not a commission." It wasn't just the words. It was the way moments like that piled up over the years. Photos where I stood just out of frame. Holiday toasts that skipped over my name. Stories told to guests about the Hayes family's real naval legacy that somehow always ended with Michael. There was one moment I'll never forget. I was home on leave the year I made lieutenant commander. My father was talking to an old friend in the kitchen, unaware I was in the hallway. "Rebecca's smart," he said, "but she's not a warfighter." I remember standing there with my promotion orders still in my bag, realizing how deep his definition of worth ran. He didn't mean it to be cruel. To him, it was simply a fact. In his mind, leadership meant standing at the front lines, not sitting in a quiet room filled with glowing screens and classified files. I learned that if I wanted recognition, I would be waiting forever. So I stopped trying to earn it from him and decided to build a career that didn't need his approval to have value. That choice came with its own cost. There's a loneliness in knowing that the people closest to you have never seen the full picture of who you are. But in a strange way, it also gave me freedom. Without their expectations weighing me down, I could chart my own course. I didn't have to compete with Michael in his arena. I had my own battlefield, and it didn't look anything like the one my father respected. It was quieter, more complex, and it required a different kind of strength. One he never asked about, but one I knew I had. When I joined the Navy, I didn't march into the spotlight. I slipped into the shadows, choosing the path of intelligence work where precision mattered more than parade drills. It wasn't the kind of job you could explain at a family barbecue. The details were buried under clearance levels and locked doors. My first posting was with a tactical data team aboard the USS Roosevelt, where I learned to spot threats before they materialized. People called me the Watchtower because I noticed patterns others overlooked. I was promoted ahead of schedule not because I was loud, but because I was right. One of my earliest major operations was codenamed Iron Shield. We intercepted signals, suggesting an attempt to breach the cyber defenses of a carrier strike group. A successful attack would have disabled navigation on a ship carrying over 5,000 personnel. My team spent 36 hours tracking the source, masking our countermeasures so the attackers never knew we were there. By the end, the carrier sailed on as if nothing had happened. The world never heard about it, but the admiral in charge knew, and he shook my hand in a secure room where no cameras were allowed. Then came Midnight Falcon. Intelligence flagged a freighter in the Pacific, unmarked but carrying a dangerous cargo of radioactive material. Within hours, I coordinated a joint operation with Australian Naval Forces and MI6. We boarded the ship in international waters, neutralized the threat, and prevented an incident that could have sparked an international crisis. I remember standing on the deck afterward, watching the sunrise over the ocean, knowing no headline would ever mention what we had just done. And yet I felt no need for a headline. There was also the mission that still lingers in the quiet corners of my mind. A SEAL team had been pinned down in a hostile region, their comms jammed and extraction window closing. The operation was called Silent Echo. I rerouted a surveillance satellite from another theater, giving them the coverage they needed to navigate to safety. When they landed back on friendly soil, no one mentioned my name, and no one asked how they'd survived. That was the nature of the work. If you succeeded, the credit belonged to someone else. If you failed, you might never get the chance to explain. My promotions came quickly, each one noted in a brief email to my mother, often met with silence from my father. Michael got glossy photos in the family Christmas card. I got a 2-line mention, if at all. At 37, I was wearing the rank of Rear Admiral, a star pinned quietly to my uniform, in a private ceremony attended by a handful of senior officers. No champagne, no public announcement. The orders were effective immediately, but the story wasn't for public release. I walked out of that ceremony with my new rank, knowing my own family still believed I worked in an office pushing papers. They had no idea I oversaw real-time operations across multiple continents, that I briefed high-ranking officials who trusted me with decisions measured in human lives. In their minds, I was a supporting role in the Hayes family narrative, someone who made reports while Michael did the real work. It was a strange mix of pride and restraint. I knew what I had achieved. I knew the people I had helped, the disasters I had prevented, the lives that existed, because my team had done our job. But I also knew that most of those victories would never be spoken of outside a secure room. I carried medals I couldn't display, commendations that had to stay in a locked safe. My career was built on silence, and that silence had become a second skin. Still, there were moments that pierced through. A note handwritten by a 4-star admiral thanking me for my sustained meritorious service of the highest caliber. A quiet salute from a SEAL I'd helped without ever meeting him face to face. Those moments mattered more than any public applause. They were the proof that the work counted, even if no one outside those walls ever knew. I never told my family about any of it. Not because I didn't want them to know, but because part of me had stopped expecting them to understand. They measured service by what they could see, and my service was built to be invisible. But as the years passed, I started to wonder if staying invisible had become too easy. And deep down, I knew there would come a day when the truth would walk into the room, whether they were ready for it or not. The day of the event was bright and sharp, the kind of spring morning where the air feels almost ceremonial. I arrived early, dressed in a tan trench coat over dark slacks, and a simple blouse blending into the stream of guests heading toward the entrance. My uniform was folded neatly in a garment bag, in the back seat of my car, pressed to perfection, the silver stars still wrapped in their protective cloth. At the gate, the young security officer scanned the list, glanced at me with polite regret, and shook his head. My name was not there. He even turned the tablet around so I could see for myself. The list was short, and it told me everything I needed to know. My father, my mother, my brother, Michael, and his wife. No Rebecca Hayes. I thanked the officer and stepped aside, watching other guests pass without a second glance. For a moment I considered leaving. I could have turned the car around and gone home, letting the story continue without me. That was what I had always done after all. But standing there, hearing the low hum of voices and the distant sound of laughter from inside, something in me refused to fade into the background again. This was my family's event, but it was also my career, my life, my name. I walked back to the parking lot slowly, my steps steady, like I was pacing myself for something I had waited years to do. The sun flashed off the chrome trim of my car as I opened the trunk. I lifted the garment bag out with both hands and laid it across the back seat, unzipping it with deliberate care. The dress whites gleamed against the dark interior, every crease sharp, every seam straight. One by one I dressed, fastening each button as if locking in the years of work, sacrifice, and silence. The stars came last. 3 polished silver points that carried the weight of everything I had done and everything they had chosen not to see. I pinned them in place and felt the shift instantly, not just in how I looked, but in how I stood. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, looking at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back at me was the same one who had spent years in secure rooms with no windows, the same one who had been absent from family photos and holiday speeches. But now she was visible, undeniable, impossible to edit out of the story. I took a slow breath and opened the door. The sound of my heels on the pavement was steady and sure. I wasn't walking in to cause a scene or to demand an apology. I was walking in to take my place, not as the daughter or the sister, but as Rear Admiral Rebecca Hayes, United States Navy, and they were about to see her for the first time. The hallway to the banquet hall was lined with portraits of men in gold braid eyes, fixed forward, as if guarding the room beyond. I walked past them, without slowing, my cover tilted just above my brow, the weight of the stars on my shoulders, both grounding and lifting me. Inside, a string ensemble was finishing a soft rendition of Anchor's Awe, the sound threading through the quiet conversations of hundreds of guests. I stepped into the back of the hall just as the MC's voice came over the microphone, inviting all Hayes family officers to the front row. Chairs shifted, heads turned toward the expected few. Then someone noticed the white uniform in the aisle. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd as the first Navy SEAL spotted me. His eyes widened and his voice cut through the murmur. Admiral Hayes, front row. It started with him, then the men beside him, then an entire section. The sound rolled across the room like a detonation. 300 SEALs in perfect unison rose to their feet. The scrape of chairs against the polished floor echoed under the vaulted ceiling metals, glinting under the lights. Their spines were straight, their arms at their sides, their voices carrying the command again. Admiral Hayes, front row. I didn't rush. I didn't wave or acknowledge the shock that was freezing my father mid-toast or the blank disbelief on my brother's face. My heels clicked steadily against the floor as the aisle opened before me, the crowd parting as if this had been rehearsed. The MC faltered microphone, lowering his words, lost under the disciplined roar of recognition. I passed table after table, eyes following me, conversations stopped cold. Vice admirals, commanders, young ensigns, barely out of the academy, all watching. Not because I had demanded it, but because I had earned it. The SEALs didn't stand for me out of politeness. They stood because they knew my name from briefings that never saw daylight, because they had walked away from missions they might not have survived without me. My father's glass was still half raised, his eyes locked on mine with a look I couldn't quite read. My mother's hands were pressed to her chest, her mouth slightly open. Michael just stood there, his expression a tangle of confusion and something that looked almost like fear. I kept my gaze forward. This wasn't the time for explanations. When I reached the front row, the officers standing there shifted aside without a word. I stepped into place, setting my cover neatly in my lap as I sat. The MC cleared his throat, his voice shaky, as he tried to adjust. "Ladies and gentlemen, Rear Admiral Rebecca Hayes." A wave of applause followed, scattered at first, then building, but it didn't matter. The moment had already happened. For the first time in my life, the room didn't look past me. It didn't crop me out. It didn't rewrite the story. I didn't need to say a word because everything they needed to know was sitting right there in front of them in 3 silver stars and the silence that followed. The formal program ended, and the room dissolved into clusters of conversation. I stood near the front, still in my seat for a moment, letting the hum of voices wash over me. One by one, senior officers broke away from their groups and approached. A vice admiral with a chest full of ribbons shook my hand and said quietly, "It's good to finally put a face to the name." Others followed, each offering a nod, a handshake, or a few words meant only for me. They didn't ask for details. They already knew what they needed to know. Michael appeared at my side, his expression still trying to catch up to the last hour. "How long have you been keeping this a secret?" His voice was low, almost cautious, like he wasn't sure how I would answer. I met his eyes and said, 15 years. He blinked, then let out a breath, the weight of the number settling between us. For a moment, he seemed like he wanted to say more, but instead he just gave a small nod and stepped back. My father was the last to approach. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, looking at me in full uniform, his gaze tracing the lines of the jacket, the stars, the medals. Finally, he gave a single slow nod. It was not an apology, not even close, but it was something I had never seen from him before. In that nod was an acknowledgement that words could not have carried. I didn't need him to tell me he was proud. That nod, in its quiet way, was the first time he had truly seen me. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It didn't erase the years of being overlooked, but it closed a distance that had been there for as long as I could remember. As the crowd thinned and the sound of clinking glasses faded, I stayed where I was for a while longer. The moment had already passed, but the change it brought felt permanent. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. I had walked in on my own terms, and I was leaving the same way. 6 months later, I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house, the same brick home that had stood through decades of deployments, homecomings, and farewells. Inside, the scent of my mother's roast filled the air, warm and familiar. I walked past the living room and stopped when I saw the display cabinet. Front and center, where Michael's Academy photo used to be, sat one of my medals, its ribbon perfectly arranged, the silver catching the light. Dinner felt different that night. My father asked about the logistics of a recent operation, not in a vague, polite way, but with real curiosity. My mother wanted to know what it was like leading a command team scattered across continents. Even Michael, sitting across from me with his fork paused midair, asked how I handled the pressure of knowing lives depended on my calls. There was no teasing, no quick shift to another topic. They listened. After dessert, Michael lingered while my parents cleared the table. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "I always thought I had to stay ahead of you. I didn't want to be the brother who couldn't keep up." He looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. "Turns out I never could, and that's okay." I smiled, not to dismiss his words, but because I finally understood that we had been carrying different weights all along. Driving home that night, I thought about the medal in the cabinet. It was a sign of recognition, yes, but it wasn't what made me feel whole. That had come the moment I walked into that hall months earlier, not for them, but for myself. I had taken my place without waiting for permission, and that was something no nod, no question, and no medal could give me. The road stretched ahead in the quiet dark, the hum of the engines steady. I realized the most important acknowledgement had never been theirs to give. It had been mine all along, and I had finally claimed it.